A funeral will be held this weekend for Pope Francis, who died on Monday after 12 years as the head of the Catholic Church. Indigenous leaders have been extending condolences, and some will be attending his funeral in Rome. In 2022, Pope Francis came to Canada to apologize for the Church's role in the residential school system. Our Truth in Politics panel is here to discuss his death and his legacy. Jennifer Lewitz is the CEO of Pasqua Strategies, and Niigaan Sinclair is a columnist with the Winnipeg Free Press. Niigaan, Jennifer, great to see you as always. Niigaan, we'll start with you, as you've been doing interviews about the death of Pope Francis all week and written your own piece there. What are your reflections on Pope Francis?
Well, Pope Francis, not only the most progressive pope in global history, he is someone who was very generous and kind, and certainly pushed the church in directions that the church had never traveled before. And I think back to at the apology in July of 2022, when Wilton Littlechild offered him a headdress as a gift. His own personal headdress, not from the Cree people or from any other treaty chiefs, but and then he said, "Can I put it on?" And that certainly showed that Pope Francis, while not perfect, certainly was interested in trying to move the church in intriguing directions.
Jennifer, Pope Francis's trip to Canada to apologize and his hosting of Indigenous leaders at the Vatican are etched in our minds for sure. What came to your mind when you heard of his passing?
A little bit of sadness. Obviously, this is a death that impacts, the entire world because you're hearing about it so much. But there's also still that little bit of weirdness where it's like, well, what is our relationship with the church and even with Catholics in general, especially because of the history. So I've seen a lot of different takes on social media, especially from Indigenous people, that, it is weird because you're seeing the entire world essentially mourning the passing of the Pope. But what is considered acceptable for us, and what does this mean for our relationship with the next Pope?
Niigaan, some Indigenous leaders are heading over for the funeral. APTN National Chief Cindy Woodhouse-Neepanak, Manitoba Métis Federation President David Chartrand. Do you think it's important for them to be there?
Well, for both of those, for First Nations, the Catholic Church has a humongously large footprint in our communities. It was survivors who demanded, called for, kindly asked for the Pope to come to Canada because they care a lot about the church, and they care a lot about the fact that many of them are Catholic and hold those values very close to the chest. It's not Indigenous peoples who are or people. We are and people, and so there's a lot of reconciliation between that. Survivors have done, many Indigenous peoples have done, between the church and traditional beliefs, and of course with the Manitoba Métis Federation, perhaps the closest group to the Catholic Church are people of the Red River Métis. It is David Chartrand who said that we should be doing more Catholic education, more teachings around Catholicism, because it is in many ways very deeply tied to Métis identity, not for all Métis, but for many. And so I'm not surprised at all that either one of them would go. And I think it's important that we do have leadership at these kinds of mourning events because they do represent First Nations, Inuit, Métis people.
Jennifer, do you think it's important for the next Pope to continue in a similar vein? And do you think that might be possible when it comes to reconciliation and things like the return of documents and other important items that the Catholic Church has, important items to Indigenous peoples?
I think it's absolutely important. We saw some pretty monumental moves coming from Prime Minister Harper during his apology, and then followed by the Pope's visit to Canada. I think, we're at this pivotal moment where we have to keep reconciliation going, which means that we need to see tangible action. So I think it's not only going to be important for us to see the next Pope champion reconciliation and what it actually means for reconciliation with survivors and Indigenous people in Canada, but also on our end and how we're advocating for that through our leaders and what they expect to see out of the next Pope.
Niigaan, it is the dying days of this federal election campaign, and there's finally been some Indigenous content to speak of as the party leaders have been doing live forums with the Assembly of First Nations. So your thoughts as this election is the last time here? We'll be speaking about the election, I guess, before we get together on voting day.
Well, I mean, certainly the NDP and the Greens did release party promises earlier in the campaign. This was a very short election campaign, also was dominated by Donald Trump. So perhaps Donald Trump sucking a lot of the oxygen out of the room, perhaps took the attention of the two leading parties, the Liberals and the Conservatives. But what we got this past week is both party platforms. On one level, you've got a Conservative platform that is by far the most engaged Indigenous peoples in history, but the bar is very, very low. There's been almost no party platform that comes anywhere close to what Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives are promising. They're even promising to support Indigenous languages and support of local media supporting Indigenous languages, which is kind of odd considering their position on certain racial groups or groups that feel disenfranchised and calling it wokeism and so on. But it is, I think, important to recognize that the Conservatives have moved in certain directions. Of course, the entire Conservative Party platform, or the large vast majority, is, when it comes to Indigenous peoples, can be summed up in a simple phrase: is build, baby, build. The Conservatives are only really interested in engaging Indigenous peoples, for the most part, to be able to get resource projects going. There's no mention of Indigenous rights in the party platform, which is very concerning, which is a little different than the Liberal Party platform, which is very robust, very thorough, not perfect by any means, but certainly continues a large portion, not all, but a large portion of many of the promises or deliverances that are under Justin Trudeau's time. They are also a sort of build, baby, build projects. They're offering very similar incentives to First Nations and Inuit Métis communities to own parts of resource projects. But the one big difference, of course, is that the Liberal Party platform has a full commitment to Indigenous rights and even a right to water, which, if you think about the past 10 years, most of the Liberal struggles have been to try to repair boil water advisories. There's still about 3 dozen of those left. If First Nations could sue or take the Canadian government to court over boil water advisories, they certainly would have got done a lot quicker, and we wouldn't be seeing some of the emergency situations that we're seeing in communities. So it is interesting to see that the Liberals are moving in that direction.
Jennifer, I'll call this the longest, shortest election campaign, at least in my mind. But is there anything that stuck out for you, if anything, during this campaign?
I think just seeing the influence that Donald Trump has had on our election and how it's almost made the parties pivot in their messaging and their priorities over the campaign period. You know, we saw Mark Carney take a break from campaigning to address what was happening in the United States. And certainly it's been interesting to see, you know, how the media has been treated throughout all of this. I think this is the first time we've actually seen this much pushback on the media from the Conservative Party during this campaign, with media not being allowed to ask questions for a lot of the rallies and stuff like that, and also not being allowed on the official party plane throughout the campaign, because that's how you get the majority of your coverage. So there's been some interesting choices that I'm curious whether or not that'll stay for the next election, or if that'll be a hard lesson learned in like what not to do. But that's pretty much it, other than, you know, the NDP they're struggling for dear life, and the party essentially just like falling apart in front of our eyes during a national campaign.
Yeah. Niigaan, any ridings that you're going to be paying attention to on Monday, and any predictions on the outcome of this election?
For anyone who's curious about watching where the First Nations Inuit Métis votes will head towards, in terms of First Nations, there's 2 ridings in particular: Churchill, Aski in the north, Kiiwetinoong in the north. You see a very close fight between Rebecca Chartrand of the Liberals, Nikki Ashton of the NDP. We've got a very long-standing incumbent facing off against someone who's riding very much the Mark Carney / anti-Donald Trump wave. We'll see if First Nations get on board, see if they come out to vote. That's really the big question about if they do come out to vote. It is showing trends that, while historically First Nations people have voted for the NDP, there is a lot of Indigenous peoples moving towards the Liberals. And the second riding I'm watching is in northern Saskatchewan, and maybe Jen can help me with the exact name of it. It's Misnithe.
There's nothing Mississippi Churchill.
Yes, and I always it's a long name for that riding, but it's an exciting fight between 3 all Indigenous candidates on the platform. And what it looks like is very close. 1% separates the Liberals and the Conservatives. There is for a long time, the NDP has held that vote. The NDP vote has bottomed out. And what we're looking at is really if First Nations voters turn towards Liberals, that could be a sign for the rest of the country. And then really any riding in Winnipeg, any riding in Saskatoon, any riding in Thunder Bay, those will tell you a lot about where Métis people are heading, where people in urban Indigenous peoples are heading. Those will be very significant fights. And if it's a red wave in those three cities, those are really big signs that there was a significant impact with Indigenous voters in this election.
Jennifer, any ridings, both that Niigaan mentioned there for sure are going to be must-watches. Any ridings that you're keeping an eye on for election night? And what do you think the Canadian government might look like come Tuesday?
All 36 ridings that AFN had identified, because I'm going to be curious where the Indigenous votes go for a lot of those. And Deathnathi Misnipi Churchill is one I'll definitely be watching, not only because it's so close to home, but also because that riding, yes, was held by the NDP for quite a while, and then it went Conservative under Gary Vidal. And interestingly enough, two of the people running right now, Jim LeMay for the Conservatives, he was a former Sask Party MLA, and then Buckley Belanger, they've actually had to go head-to-head in a previous election provincially, and Jim LeMay had beat out Buckley Belanger, but now there's a really good chance that Buckley Belanger, who's representing the Liberals, beats out Jim LeMay, but now just in a federal sense. So it's really interesting to see the dynamics there. And that northern riding is also very community heavy. The Elections Canada did redraw the riding redistribution, so it's actually smaller. They gutted some of the rural. And so now it's just a small riding population-wise, but very big geographically. But it's also going to be which candidate can best swing the big family dynamics in those Indigenous communities in the north. You know, Jim LeMay, I believe he's from La Loche. I'm not 100% sure. I think Buckley Belanger, but don't get maybe LaRange. I'm not 100% sure where he's from, but it's going to be which communities they can sway to come out in larger numbers to vote for them. And then, yeah, I'll be watching down south as well. You know, the old riding that Ralph Goodale had served. That is now being held by Michael Cram. There is potential that it goes back to being Liberal. And then a couple of Saskatoon ridings as well that are always tough fights to win. So I'll be keeping an eye on all of those. And then come Tuesday, what the government will look like, I don't actually know. I'm somebody that does believe the polls, and I think we have a pretty clear indication of where this could go. But at the same time, it wouldn't be the first time in history we've had an upset of what public opinion polling is telling us. So I don't know.
I'm curious, just one other last thing, and I think that Jen pinpointed it. I certainly talked about it because in our podcast at the Winnipeg Free Press, I had sort of an on-air discussion with Eric Grenier, who's one of the large pollers in the country and one of the most significant sort of keeping track of sort of the majority of polls. And many of the ridings that were Indigenous, that were from that list of 36, but also Métis-specific ridings in areas like Winnipeg, Saskatoon, Regina, Thunder Bay, his numbers are quite different than my numbers or that we have at the Free Press. That really indicates that, you know, for many Indigenous voters, the local candidates are important. Mm-hmm. This is not something in which you see Indigenous voters just simply following the federal parties. And I think that that's interesting. And I'm very interested in, as I think Jen is, if you see the national polls, but then you see the way Indigenous voters go, it tells you a lot about how the important local dynamics of families, the candidates' specific connections, the promises that are made to chiefs, those kinds of things, they really matter for Indigenous peoples and voters in particular.
Niigaan, do you know who or thoughts on who's going to be forming government come Tuesday?
Well, I think if I were to, if you were to look at the polls and the ways that the momentum is swinging and the fact that Donald Trump yet came out again and started to threaten Canada, I think that the momentum is just too much for the Liberals. The question is whether there'll be a majority or a minority, and it depends on what hour you approach me. This hour, I'm saying a Liberal majority.
Well, Jen and I also did the In Focus podcast this week, and I'll mention, Niigaan, that I ate my words on the Jagmeet Singh being the most productive NDP leader when I took you to task there and said it was Leighton. But I think you're right with the whole pharmacare and dental care. So I said that you.
But oddly enough, it's not really going to win him another term as leader. If all polls suggest and they're below 12, which is party status, we could be seeing the end of Jagmeet Singh's career as an NDP leader.
Right. Well, speaking of eating things, if either of those Thunder Bay ridings go blue, I will eat my tie on election night here. And we're going to be lucky enough to have you both with us, of course, on election night for our Decision 2025 coverage. Looking forward to it. Thanks to you both.
Yeah, you bet.
Thank you.